I see people coming back into the room, so I will welcome you back to Stoicon-X Orlando for 2020. We are halfway through our event today, and our next speaker is Donald Robertson. He'll be starting in one moment, so everyone get your drinks and get comfortable in your chair. All right, so now I'm introducing Donald Robertson. He's an international speaker and one of the notable modern Stoics who's leading the charge and introducing or reintroducing Stoicism to the world. I could say a lot more, but I'll just turn it over to Donald and let him share his screen if he needs to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. So let me begin by just making sure I can share my screen with you. There you go. Give it a sec. So I think you can all see that okay, yeah? It says Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism, Love and Anger. Thank you. Oh gosh, actually those are four of my favorite subjects, eh? Stoicism, love and anger. I love talking about these topics in particular. And incidentally, this is a good opportunity for me to throw some artwork into my slides. So these are illustrations by my good friend Z Nuno Fraga in Portugal, who's working on Verissimus, our graphic novel about the life of Marcus Aurelius. So I'm just going to dive straight in and say, you know, like if I didn't know anything about Stoicism and I didn't know who Marcus Aurelius was and I picked up the Meditations and read it, I think people might see different things in it. I think potentially that I would see it as a book that's mainly about love and about anger, and the two things being kind of competing impulses or emotions. And if you look closely, I don't think this pops out immediately, but it's a book that seems at one level to be about a personal struggle with anger. Here are the clues. Why? We're going to do a deep dive into the Meditations to the extent that we're going to be doing a little bit of detective work. So Marcus says in the opening sentence that from his grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus, he acquired nobility of character, but also evenness of temper, or more specifically, he literally says in Greek, freedom from anger. So this is in the opening sentence of the book. And we also know that he struggled with anger because he says so very explicitly a little bit later in book 1. He thanks the gods that with regard to none of them, his friends or family, did I ever lapse into any serious offence, although my disposition was such that I might well have behaved in such a manner if circumstances had favoured it. In other words, he says he's prone to anger and he was thanking the gods that nothing triggered his anger and he didn't end up acting on it. But through the grace of the gods, no conjunction of circumstances ever developed, which would have put me to the test. Although I was often angry, he says, interestingly, ironically, with Junius Rusticus, his main Stoic mentor. So of all the people that Marcus Aurelius remembers being particularly angry with, the person that really rubbed him up the most the wrong way was his Stoic teacher. He said he was grateful that he never resorted to measures that he might have regretted. Now, there are some things maybe I don't have time to explain here. I've spent a lot of time really studying in close detail Marcus's life. I'm in the middle of writing a biography of him at the moment for Yale. And, you know, Marcus would have seen examples, particularly from Hadrian, of an emperor acting very violently and impulsively. And I think as a teenager, as a young man, he was actually quite frightened by that, is the impression that I get. He didn't want to become a maniac like Hadrian. Hadrian became towards the end of his reign, and he was quite concerned about what an emperor, someone with in a sense, absolute power, can do when he loses his temper. So, and also, I'm not going to say a great deal today about the Stoic theory of anger, but I'll touch on it a little bit. Basically, the Stoics conceptualize anger cognitively, and they view it as a desire for revenge. So interestingly, the Stoics view anger as very much a desire. It's the desire to take revenge on one who's thought to have inflicted an undeserved injury. Now, that happens to be virtually identical to a modern cognitive theory of anger that's found in the Cognitive Therapy of Emotional Disorders, which was published in like 1960s or early 1970s by Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy. It's virtually identical to a modern theory of anger. And Marcus also says, the Stoics also say that hatred is a growing and persistent desire that things go badly for someone, or spite is pleasure at another person's misfortune. So these are a cluster of emotions that go together, and they have to do with taking pleasure in harm inflicted on another person, or the desire to harm another person. And there's a famous argument in Book 1 of Plato's Republic. It's put in the mouth of Socrates, where he critiques an ancient Greek theory of justice. And it's a cliche in Greek culture to say that justice consists in helping your friends and harming your enemies. And Socrates tackles that head on and says, paradoxically, that he disagrees and thinks that justice consists in helping your friends and also helping your enemies. For the simple reason that he thinks if you genuinely harmed your enemies, you'd make them even worse than they are already, which seems like a foolish thing to do. And the Stoics stand in that Socratic tradition. They think that to really mature, to reach our potential psychologically and morally, we need to transcend the primitive desire for revenge, this kind of childish, primitive desire to harm other people when we're upset with them, and reach a more philosophical attitude towards our enemies, or those who do objectionable things, and actually seek to reform or educate or enlighten them instead. And this is really the basis of the Stoic concept of justice. Now, something else I'm going to do that's maybe a little bit unusual. I'm going to put some emphasis on the influence that Marcus Aurelius' mother had over his formation. And she's someone that we don't know a great deal about, but we do know one or two intriguing things about her. For sure, Domitia Lucilla was a very intelligent, highly educated and independent woman, quite a formidable woman in a sense. Now, although Marcus calls her my little mother, so she was kind of petite, but in terms of her personality and intellect, quite formidable. Marcus's father died when Marcus was around about 3 years old. And so he was left very much in the care of his mother, who was a Hellenophile. She loved Greek culture. And I don't know this for sure. It's one of the little historical facts that drive me crazy and I wish I knew the answer to. But there's a hint that Marcus's mother was friends with Junius Rusticus. And I would love to know whether it was Marcus's mother that decided that Junius Rusticus was going to be his tutor. I think it probably would have been, in which case it was his mum that basically introduced Marcus to Stoicism, we might say. That would be very interesting if it was the case. But what I'm really interested in here is that Fronto, Marcus Cornelius Fronto, his rhetoric tutor, who was good friends with Marcus's mum, has this interesting conversation with Marcus in his private correspondence, where Fronto, writing in Latin, he's a Latin scholar, says there is no Latin equivalent for the Greek word philostorgia, which means brotherly love or compassion or affection. And Marcus in the Meditations says something about this. He says he thanks Fronto for enlightening him with regard to the fact that patricians or Roman nobles typically lack natural affection or warmth. When Marcus is describing his mother, he makes a point of saying she's unlike other wealthy Romans. And Marcus's mother was extremely wealthy. She was, strangely, a construction magnate in Rome. She owned a brick and tile factory. And we know this to be true because today there are hundreds of bricks with her name stamped on them that have been discovered by archaeologists. She was a very powerful, influential figure in the construction industry in Rome. Fronto compares her to the Greek goddess Athena. He sees this woman as the center of an intellectual circle, and astoundingly, Fronto, one of the preeminent intellectuals of his era, the leading rhetorician in Latin, is anxious about Lucilla reading his letters in Greek. He asks Marcus kind of quaintly to proofread them first before he shows them to his mother. So we can safely say that she was a highly literate woman because Marcus Cornelius Fronto was frightened that she was going to pick him up on errors in his Greek. And both of them, Marcus and Fronto, praise her for philistorgia. And that's another regard in which she seems to have been unlike the patricians that they felt so uncomfortable with. She was a patrician, but unlike the ones that Marcus and Fronto were criticizing, she did show natural affection and seems to have somewhat embodied it for the both of them. Now, also, it might surprise many people who think of Stoicism as a kind of cold philosophy to know that Marcus talks at length in the Meditations about learning about love, affection, forgiveness, and related values or virtues from his Stoic mentors. He says regarding Rusticus that from Rusticus he learned, with respect to those who have offended me by words or done me wrong, to be easily disposed, to be pacified and reconciled as soon as they have shown a readiness to be reconciled. Now, again, that's interesting because if we join a couple of dots here, he also says Rusticus was the main person that offended him and upset him. So Rusticus, the guy that made Marcus lose his temper most often, was also the same guy that showed him how to be reconciled after an argument. It's one of the main things that Marcus says that he learned from him. From Sextus of Chaeronea, who was a later tutor that Marcus went to, he says he learned that he never displayed even a sign of anger, a trace of anger, or of any other unhealthy passion, but seemed at once to be completely free from these unhealthy passions and yet full of philistorgia, or brotherly love, you might say, platonic love, natural affection, whatever you want to call it. Now, I think that's a very interesting passage because Marcus is describing, in a sense, the Stoic ideal exemplified by Sextus of Chaeronea, to have apatheia, to be free from passion, and yet nevertheless to be full of philistorgia, or compassion, love, affection for his fellow man. From Claudius Severus, who is allegedly an Aristotelian, but Marcus talks about learning a lot about Stoicism from him. He says to love my family, to love truth, to love justice, and to believe that I am loved by my friends. From Claudius Maximus, another Stoic tutor, Marcus says he learned he was accustomed to perform acts of kindness and was ready to forgive. And from Seneca Tullus, a Stoic tutor about whom we know very little, Marcus said he learned to love his children very authentically, very sincerely. So these guys that taught Marcus about Stoicism, also each one of them taught him about familial or natural affection, love, and forgiveness. So you can see now I'm not as crazy as I sounded at first, perhaps, when I said that I thought the Meditations, in a sense, was a book about the philosophy of love. Now, the virtue of kindness is the Stoic antidote to anger. The Stoics say that if we want to counter a vice or an unhealthy passion, one way to do it is to try to cultivate the opposing or contrary virtue and healthy passion, or the eupatheiai, healthy passions. So we have healthy, rational, and moderate passions in Stoicism. And the healthy and rational form of desire includes kindness, but also goodwill, affection, and warmth. Now, translating emotional terms from a language like ancient Greek into modern English is notoriously difficult because there often isn't a one-to-one correspondence, right? The way they map emotions and desires is not the same as the way that we do, but we get a rough idea of the type of emotions that they're talking about. So the question I want to ask is, can Marcus's Stoic remedies for anger, of which he lists 10, be viewed as recipes for cultivating philistorgia, or natural affection? And here you'll see is another example of a passage where Marcus places the cultivation of philistorgia front and center. He says, adapt yourself to the circumstances among which your lot has been cast, and love the people among whom your lot has fallen, but love them sincerely. So in the Greek, it's clear that he means love them authentically, and that's something that we'll come back to later. Don't just fake it or pretend, but have a genuine brotherly love or natural affection for the rest of humanity. There's also, incidentally, I haven't quoted it here, but there's a passage where he just straight up says, follow the gods, love mankind, like about as concisely and about as clearly as he can possibly put it. So if you want a quote that sums this up, Marcus Aurelius says, love mankind, clear as crystal. And that's a theme that recurs throughout the whole of the book. So the 10 gifts from Apollo. In book 11, passage 18 is my favourite part of the meditations, I guess. I think it should be every cognitive behavioural therapist's favourite part of the book. So Marcus says, here are 10 remedies for anger. They come from the 9 muses and their leader, Apollo. Now, Apollo is the god of pandemics, incidentally. He's the god of plague, but he's also the god of healing and disease. And so he's the therapist's god, if you like. And so it's appropriate that these therapy techniques would be attributed to him. Marcus says, remember these 9 rules as if you'd received them as a gift from the muses and begin at last to be a human being while you still have life in you. That's interesting that he thinks his humanity itself depends upon conquering anger. Let's let that sink in for a moment. So I'm not going to read these quotes in length because really what I want to do is talk about the significance of them, but I'll throw the slides up somewhere later and I'm sure you can all read them. Or you can just go and look at book 11, passage 18 in the meditations. But I'll give you the gist of them. So the first strategy is Marcus's favorite one. He refers to it repeatedly throughout the meditations, but it's one that might seem cryptic to modern readers. It's to remember that we are inherently social animals. Now, that's important to Stoics because it really stands in a very old philosophical tradition. I think it would be hard for people to see that without, in ancient Greece and Rome, without seeing it as alluding to a tradition that goes all the way back to Protagoras, who wrote a famous speech which we call the Great Discourse, which argues that human beings are inherently social beings and argues in favor of the idea that justice is a natural virtue. And particularly it's a virtue associated with Zeus. Zeus is the god of friendship and community. And so Zeus is particularly associated with this idea of kind of bonds between human beings and forming societies, and the principle of justice being something that contributes to that. So Marcus thinks humans are inherently social animals. I just want to mention as well in passing that Protagoras' speech, and Protagoras was a contemporary of Socrates, slightly older man. And Socrates' relationship with the sophists is complicated. They're kind of frenemies, I would say. You know, it's a bit of a love-hate relationship. He likes some of the things that they say about virtue. It's a weirdly quasi-evolutionary argument. He basically, in the very short version of it, he says, other animals have means of survival. They have tough skins and claws, and they can dig into burrows and things, but humans are born naked and defenseless. And really, we depend on forming communities for our survival in order to protect ourselves. And so they want to argue that we have this inherent tendency to bond and build communities. And the Stoics therefore say that it's a natural goal for mankind to develop reason, because we can think and use language. We have a duty then to reason well, but because we also form communities naturally, right, we have a duty to do that properly, to do it well, to do it wisely. And to form communities wisely would be to live justly and to have a kind of a desire to help and improve those around us rather than harm them and make them worse. Now, whatever we make of this argument, it's very important to Marcus. He mentions it more than any of the other strategies that we're about to see. The second strategy he mentions is considering the other person's character as a whole, if we're becoming angry with them in particular. And so I would say these remedies for anger can also, the flip side is you could say that the Stoics would say this is a prerequisite for genuine, authentic, rational love. This is the love of the wise man or woman. There's also a kind of passionate, irrational, excessive infatuation in love, but the Stoics want to replace that with a healthy, rational, balanced attitude of love and affection. And in order to achieve that, we'd have to transcend anger and consider the other person's character as a whole. So that would mean, very simply, a kind of authentic love where we view them warts and all. And we neither idealize the other person nor demonize them. We don't engage in selective thinking, but we love the whole person. And I actually think a good way, when we talk about love, I think we tend to think about boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives and romantic love. But there are many types of love. We love our friends, and also like the love of a parent for children is, if anything, for the Stoics, more paradigmatic in terms of understanding the philosophical love in general. So to love your children would be to love them warts and all, authentically for who they really are, not trying to mold them in a particular direction, or loving only the certain aspects of them and not others, but trying to view them in a rounded and complete way as whole human beings. As we say in courtrooms, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, this is the most controversial strategy, the third one, and this is straight up a quote from Socrates. I firmly believe that the Stoics view themselves as a Socratic sect, that Socrates is the godfather of Stoicism. And there are many references to Socratic thought in the Stoic literature that aren't obvious at first, but this one's glaringly obvious. This is something that's particularly associated with Socrates. The idea that Socrates had that no one is voluntarily deprived of the truth. No rational being fundamentally wants to be deceived about the most important things in life, Socrates said. People might deceive themselves about other things, but they don't want to be fundamentally deceived about the most important things. And he concludes from that nobody wants to be misled or mistaken about what's right or good in life, and that no one therefore wants to be morally ignorant, and no one does evil knowingly, and therefore, as a consequence, no one does evil willingly. So this is a very generous argument towards wrongdoing, but it's a very famous argument that's reverberated throughout the centuries, and Marcus completely embraces it. So we all naturally desire truth and fulfillment, or eudaimonia, but we're all kind of foolish and intemperate, and we all make mistakes about how to achieve our true goal. So the Stoics start from this premise that we all want eudaimonia, we all want to flourish, we all want to grasp the truth about life, but every one of us is straying from the path. We're all imperfect, and we're all wrong in important regards. Love, therefore, entails empathy and forgiving other people for mistakes, understanding that deep down people want to grasp the truth. Nobody wants to get life wrong. But anger, by contrast, is very unforgiving. Number 4, and this is a corollary really of that, is to remember that you're not perfect yourself, Marcus says, and he's right. This is a very powerful, it takes humility to do this, but it's a very powerful anger management strategy. This might not be obviously Socratic at first, but the Socratic method of questioning, the trademark Socratic method, the alenchus, Socrates describes in the Apology and elsewhere as a therapy for removing conceit about the most important things in life, for puncturing arrogance. So Socrates says the method of questioning that he uses allows us to expose when someone believes that he knows something that in fact he does not know, particularly with regard to the most important things in life, i.e. the goal of life and the virtues. And so Socratic questioning is all about a kind of intellectual humility. It's all about recognizing that we're contradicting ourselves and that we're imperfect. So we heard earlier this quote about Seneca, where he presents himself not as an expert, but as a fellow patient who's simply been undergoing treatment for longer, advising the patient in the hospital bed beside him. So the Stoics believed there is no ideal sage. Even Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, even Cleanthes and Chrysippus were fools and vicious. Like we all are, we're all in the same boat in that regard. But some people have been working for a bit longer, and so maybe we can learn from their progress while acknowledging that they're imperfect. But we must therefore acknowledge our own imperfections. Love requires humility and respect for the other people in that regard, whereas anger is narcissistic and self-righteous. Anger always believes that it's 100% in the right, it doesn't question itself. It's part of its rigid, dogmatic nature. So love would be the opposite. Number 5, you can't read other people's minds. So the Stoics weren't skeptics. They believed that there are certain things in life that we can grasp with certainty. And lucky for us, the Stoics believed that it's the most important things in life that we can grasp with certainty, i.e. the fact that virtue is the only true good, something they thought we could grasp with certainty. But there's a whole bunch of things that we can't know. Like, not with certainty anyway, we can speculate about them. And the entire domain of what other people are thinking is something that we have to infer. And the Stoics thought we make a mistake by acting as if we have absolute certainty about another person's motives, when in fact it's virtually impossible to achieve this. Right? So we should suspend judgment and keep an open mind, cognitive flexibility, we call it in therapy today, about what other people are thinking. Love accepts the other's independence and acknowledges that we don't know for sure what motivates other people, whereas anger is the opposite and presumes to know everything. Angry people know for sure that the person that they're angry with is a bad one. Why anger jumps to conclusions prematurely about other people's motives. Marcus says we should also remember that life is transient. And this is a theme that applies right across the board in Stoicism. Some of these are very common Stoic strategies that really apply to all aspects of life, but here he's applying them to anger, and I'm arguing that the flip side of that is that they also define what Stoics mean by love. So Epictetus tells us to remind ourselves that our loved ones are mortal relationships, and our loved ones are on loan from nature, and that we should seize the day and value our time together. So it's really by appreciating that, other people aren't under our control. We can lose them. They can change. We can change. Life doesn't last forever. Something maybe that's become more obvious during the pandemic, our own mortality is perhaps more salient. And reminding ourselves of that helps us to realize that the things that we're angry about might seem less important, might seem more trivial than we normally assume them to be, but it also allows us to fully appreciate the opportunity that we have to befriend other people, get to know them, and to learn to love them. Number 7, you'll all recognize this one. It's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. Marcus says it's not people's actions that trouble us, but the opinions that we form about those actions. So clear as crystal, he's paraphrasing Epictetus here. But I'm going to shock many of you here today and tell you that this iconic quote from Epictetus, in my opinion, actually derives from Socrates also. This concept is expressed in Plato's Republic and in other Platonic dialogues where it's attributed to Socrates. But it's also in the Socratic dialogues of Xenophon. So I think it's quite plausible this idea goes all the way back to the godfather of Stoicism himself, and it didn't just start with Epictetus. And by the way, in the following sentence, Epictetus says, therefore, Socrates, for example, he says death isn't inherently terrifying. Otherwise, Socrates would also have been terrified of death, and he was not. So it's a common Stoic strategy to say, if other people feel differently about something that's upsetting you, that should be a clue that it's not the thing itself that upsets you, but rather your way of looking at it, your opinions about it. An example that Epictetus gives is Socrates, and that's partly because I think he recognizes that this idea comes from Socrates. So I would say anger tends to fuse opinions with reality. When people are really passionately angry, they don't believe that it's their opinions that are upsetting them. They believe it's that guy over there that's upsetting them. It's something you said or did that's really pissing me off. It's not my opinions about what you said or did. It's you. You're the problem, buddy. That's what people think when they're angry. So people are fused with their beliefs when they're angry, and they fuse their opinions with external reality. Whereas love takes responsibility for its feelings. It has to, because there are ups and downs in relationships. And if we're going to navigate those properly, we have to take responsibility for our feelings and realize the extent to which we're contributing to them ourselves. Otherwise, we just end up blaming other people. Number 8, the Stoics typically associate this point with the preceding one. This is another Stoic slogan that says, our passions do us more harm than the things that they refer to, the externals. And here Marcus says that anger and distress bring us more suffering than the very things that give rise to that anger. So this is an interesting one because we can flip it right round and say, I don't know of anywhere that the Stoics really explicitly say this, although they may do, but the corollary of this is if anger does us more harm than the things that we're angry about, then you could easily say that the Stoics also believe that love does us more good than the people that we love, or love benefits us more than being loved. So the Stoics are full of paradoxes. People assume that one of the most important things in life is to be loved by others, or at least they act as if that's what they believe. But for Stoics, giving love, like feeling love, is more important, infinitely more important than being loved in return, because experiencing love transforms our character. It's part and parcel of the virtue of dikaiosune, which we translate badly, I think, as justice. But really it's social virtue in general. Anger is blind to how it harms us. When people are really angry, they really don't think about the harm that anger is doing to their character. But when we experience rational love, the way the Stoics define it, we would have to grasp that really it's the love itself that we experience for other people that's the main thing. And again, I think that's more obvious with children. If you're a parent and you have kids, sometimes they're hard to love, like, because they do annoying things, man. They'll put like custard in your shoes and break the TV remote control and stuff like that. You know, they can be quite frustrating at times, but still you love your kids if you're a good parent, you know, and you realize that your love for them isn't dependent on whether they happen to be behaving themselves that day or not, or whether they're doing everything that you would like them to do. It's love itself that's really the goal for Stoics. And by that, I mean the ability to experience love towards other people. So having love reciprocated, experiencing it in return, Stoics might describe as a preferred indifferent. It's preferable, but it's not directly under our control. So we have to accept the fact rationally that it's something that we don't have control over. And number 9, the point I made earlier, that kindness itself is the antidote to anger. Marcus describes kindness as invincible, and I think so often people misread that. They assume that he means that if you're kind to someone, it'll somehow coerce them into doing what you want. And I think that's often what people might mean today when they say kill them with kindness. But that's not what Marcus means. He couldn't mean that, because the Stoics think that we have to accept, if we're going to be wise, that other people aren't directly under our control. I think what he means is that love is invincible in the sense that nobody can stop you from having love. Like, it's completely under your control. It's an attitude that you can choose to voluntarily adopt. Even if you don't happen to have a warm, fuzzy glow, you can still adopt the values that constitute a loving attitude, and nobody can prevent you from doing that. And he thinks it consists of a desire to help others rather than harming them, but it must be an end in itself. If you love other people in order to get love back from them, then it would become merely a means to an end. And that's something the Stoics see as problematic, and Socrates would see as problematic. Virtue for the Stoics is its own reward. If virtue is a means to an end, then it becomes insincere. Like Seneca says, you know, people who are friends with you only insofar as they get something in return are what we call fair weather or inauthentic friends. But somebody who has genuine love for other people, it wouldn't be conditional on the way that they respond. And that seems like a crazy idea. What if the other person's horrible and abusive to you? Socrates says we have to figure out a way to be able to love even our enemies. And loving our enemies might involve throwing them in jail, like if it happens to be what we think is best for them and best for society. But the underlying motive should come from a place of compassion rather than retribution or revenge. So there's an example in the Meditations. I'm not going to go through that, but it's an interesting example where Marcus seems to literally tell us what he imagines saying to somebody who's angry with him. He says, "No, my son, we're born for something other than this. It's not I who am harmed, it is you, my son, who are causing harm to yourself. Now, incidentally, it's unclear whether he's saying my son figuratively or he literally means his son, who at that time, I think the only living son he had was Commodus, who would have been about 14 or 15 years old. So it is possible he's imagining a conversation with Commodus here. So good luck with that one, Marcus. You can't win them all. But notice that the two things he says there, that he's trying to educate the other person about the Stoic philosophy of love. And the two things he says here are the first strategy and then one of the later strategies. We were born for something other than this. We were born for philostorgia. We were born for natural affection. We were born to help one another. That's what he's alluding to. It's not I who are harmed, son. It's you who are causing harm to yourself. Anger does us more harm than the things that we're angry about. It's this other famous Stoic slogan that he's alluding to here. So all he's doing is expressing two Stoic slogans. Now, finally, the 10th gift comes from the god Apollo himself, whom I said earlier was the god of healing. But really, I sold him short because Apollo, in addition to being the leader of the Muses, is also the god of Delphi and the oracle. He's the god of prophecy. And Marcus says, if you will, accept this 10th gift from Apollo, the leader of the Muses, namely that it is sheer madness to expect the bad to do no wrong, for that is to wish for the impossible. And he adds, as emperor, to allow that they should do wrong to others, yet demand that they should do no wrong to yourself is senseless and tyrannical. So there's a little bit of politics tagged onto it as well there. Anger is temporary madness, the Stoics say. So when people are angry, they often think, I can't believe what that guy's doing over there. Whereas the Stoic sage is never shocked or surprised. The Stoic sage expects other people to be unstoic. And that's really, a really important point, because I see people all the time on the Stoic community saying, why isn't everybody in here more Stoic? And that to me seems like an odd thing to say, because throughout the meditations, Marcus makes it clear over and over and over again that it's foolish to expect everyone else to be perfectly enlightened. And it's a mark of wisdom to expect other people to be unstoic, to be foolish or vicious, and therefore to be unsurprised when other people are angry or upset with you. Stoic love is reasonable in that regard. It anticipates other people's fallibilities and our own, whereas anger imposes unrealistic expectations on others. For example, expecting everyone else to be perfectly stoic would be a recipe for anger. And with that, my good friends, I conclude another little skit from our graphic novel there depicting Marcus Aurelius trying and failing to educate his son Commodus. So I think went a little bit over my half hour, but hopefully we've still got plenty of time for questions. Oh, your mic's off, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, we still have some questions, and we have 8 minutes to do so. The first question is, are you still traveling in Greece?
Yeah. Well, say traveling, but I was traveling, and then I was shipwrecked here. Like, I had a whole cargo of Tyrian purple, and it sank, and now I found myself shipwrecked at the port of Piraeus. It's a bit like that story. I was kind of traveling, and then I decided just to stay here. So I'm going to probably divide my time between Athens and Toronto, although because of the pandemic, I'm going to wait it out in Athens until the worst of it's over and it's safe to travel again.
Okay.
But I'm in Athens at the moment, yeah.
Super. Okay. The next question comes from Candace. She asks, sometimes anger can lead to action. Sometimes that action is in response to self-preservation. If we distance ourselves from that anger or mediate it with kindness, do we risk not acting in a situation that requires action?
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is the sort of motivational theory of anger, that sometimes anger could be useful. And actually, so people make that argument in a number of different ways. You've alluded to the idea that we could use it for self-defense there. I'm not going to be able to give a kind of complete rounded knockdown argument, but I'll just point out a couple of things that are relevant here. Like, first of all, over the years, I've had the opportunity to have this conversation with lots and lots of different people, including a lot of people that served in the military or worked in security or who were boxers or martial arts experts. And so I said to them, what do you guys think about the idea that anger could be really useful as a form of self-protection? And sometimes people think it's useful, but generally speaking, people that have told me that who are expert fighters, that they think actually anger is quite risky in terms of self-defense as a strategy. One way of understanding it is when we're angry, our main motive is to try and hurt the other person. But if you want to defend yourself, you're better off actually fighting or acting much more tactically. So either finding an escape route or maybe disarming the other person. So someone who's really angry might just throw loads of haymakers and punch the other person in the nose. In fact, notoriously, angry people tend to underestimate risk, and so they're more likely to expose themselves to injury, right? So from that perspective, actually, you'd say it's a particularly bad strategy for self-defense. So someone who's very skilled and tactical at self-defense might be, oh, I didn't catch that. Is that a question?
I think it was just background noise. Someone has their mic off, but yeah, continue with your answer.
Yeah, like someone who's fighting more tactically might, rather than just kind of lashing out at the other person, might attempt to restrain them or immobilize them or disarm them, for example.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question before the giveaway. You mentioned rational love in your presentation, and I think that's a gateway to a good understanding that Stoicism is not just practical for a lot of aspects of our lives, but in romance and relationships. I think, gosh, how many needless arguments could we avoid by just saying, gee, I was wrong and I'll fix it next time,
I think the Stoics had a lot to say about sex and about love. And, but most of it was excised by later Roman authors who were kind of shocked by some of the things that the early Greek, for several reasons. And one little snippet of information that we know is that in Zeno's Republic, he said that they should abolish the laws against adultery. So the Stoics, the early Stoics, the Greek Stoics, you could say, were in favor of a kind of free love. They didn't want people to be punished for adultery. And I think the part of their philosophy is to love other people in a non-possessive way. So that's a controversial aspect of it maybe today, but nevertheless, they had quite specific, quite concrete ideas about how their philosophy would affect the way that we think of our romantic relationships.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Donald. It was a pleasure listening to you speak. And we're going to do the giveaway now. By the way, everyone, Donald's publisher was very gracious in providing us with 3 copies of his book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. So what I've done here, I'm going to share my screen so you can see this randomizer program, which I program myself on the web. I'm pasting in a list of all of the attendees right now, and it's going to pick someone at random. All right, Mike Magical is the first winner. I know him in Orlando. I'm writing down his name. The next winner is Ranjini in Toronto. And we'll go one more time. We have 3 copies of the book. The next one is Julie. I don't know Julie, but for all these winners, if you send me your email address in the chat window, or if you go to the Meetup site and direct message me, you can send me your email that way, and then I'll get all your shipping information. Also, thinking ahead, like a Stoic does, if I'm going to pick one more random name as an alternate in case one of those 3 does not contact me. So the alternate is Matt, and that's we have 2 Matts on the call. One is Matt Home, and this is Matt number 2. So it's mat number 2 who is our alternate winner. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing. And we're coming up on 3:30. Thanks again to Donald Robertson. We're so glad to have you here today. And I appreciate your spending the time with us. We're going to take a break for a moment, and then we'll come back as I do our walkthrough of the painted porch, the ancient ruin in Athens, Greece, where I was last year. So everyone, let's take a break. We'll come back in 2 minutes.